Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita as explained by Paramhansa Yogananda. Today we're still on page chapter 12 of the book, if I'm correct, which is called The Nature of Right Action. We're going to be hanging out in this chapter for a good while longer because there's a lot to say. We are on the second verse of the Gita, stanza number 47. And it says, "Action in this realm of vibration is a duty, but let not your ego crave the fruits of action. Be not attached to either action or inaction." There's action in inaction. There's a Sunday reading on the Ananda flow where it's about action and inaction and inaction. And it's just, every time I say those words, for whoever happens to get assigned to that reading always has to practice a lot in front of a mirror to be able to get those words out. I think Swami himself was a little amused when he wrote it, because it gets to be very complicated, because it is a very complicated idea. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about here, let's begin. Action in this realm of vibration is a duty. Sri Yukteswar put it in, "He who breathes the free air of earth is under an obligation to render grateful service," is how he puts it. And it's, so many ideas in the Gita have so many dimensions. And this one, action in the realm of vibration, they're trying to explain to us, they, meaning the masters, are trying to help us understand just how very different the world is than it first seems to the neophyte soul, you might say, to the young soul, when you first start just coming into this world and moving around in it. By the time you're reading the Gita, by the time you're seeking a spiritual path, you've advanced through literally millions of cycles of incarnations. I've been reading recently a book that I've read several times in my life, which is actually about the life of Sri Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was an avatar who lived in the 1800s in India and spent most of all of his adult life as a pujari, as a priest in a temple dedicated to Kali in Dakshineshwar outside of Calcutta. Ramakrishna is widely revered throughout the world as one of the great spiritual figures of our time. Master himself had great reverence for him. There's a 2-volume biography of him that was written by one of his disciples named Swami Saradananda. I don't always recommend books. My responsibility is to introduce you to Swami's teaching and Master's teaching, Master's ray. But there are things that are also very moving to touch into, and the life of Ramakrishna is one of them. This 2-volume biography is very, very detailed, and Ramakrishna's life was radical on a level that almost no one can even imagine. And mostly through his 20s, he had this passionate commitment for God realization and for a vision of Divine Mother that made people who did not have the spiritual sensitivity to perceive him accurately think that he was absolutely out of his mind. They were just sure that he'd gone completely crazy, and only as time passed did the nature of his madness prove to be divine. Well, reading this biography, just a few pages at a time, helps one to realize how lukewarm our commitment, most of us, is to the spiritual path compared to the way these great souls throw themselves into it. Of course, Master's life is also full of examples. Him walking down the street and stopping and picking up some rotting rice and saying, "There's no difference between this rotten rice and the divine itself," and then just eating it with relish. I have to laugh. One of my friends, who's an editor, when he was reading the book where Swamiji, the manuscript where Swamiji had written that very story, Swami had said he ate it with relish. And the editor wrote back, pickles, chutney, because language has so many different meanings, you can really get confused. So I heard myself say it that way. There was a joke between that Swamiji had, not only with me, but with many other people, that because he was so, such a consummate wordsmith and was so often speaking or writing, he was always hearing, all the nuances. And at one point when he corrected me, I never learned the rules of grammar. I just was raised in a household where it was spoken correctly, so I just knew what it was supposed to sound like. But somehow the I and me and when you use which one, it's just eluded me all my life. And Swamiji for 40 years had to correct me always on that point. And once we were on a very large radio program together, the interviewer thought it would be fun to have one of Swami's students as well as him on the program. And right in the middle of the program, I said the I or the me incorrectly, and Swami just corrected me right there, which we both found quite humorous, even though the interviewer was quite bewildered. And it was then, or soon after, that Swami said simply, "The editor never sleeps." And that's just it became a watchword between us. When I said once about P.G. Woodhouse, I think this was actually the first time he said it, I said that P.G. Woodhouse was ridiculously entertaining. Swami said, no, he was entertainingly ridiculous. And of course, and that was when he said, "The editor never sleeps." So that thought always permeates me especially every time I get close to I or me. Now, Master ate the rice without chutney, but with enthusiasm, because he just perceived this world in an entirely different way than the rest of us perceive it. So when we have instructions like is given in this chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where it says, "Let not your ego crave the fruits of action." I mean, who in this world, how few in this world would be the way to say it, are not conscious of the potential results when they act. And yet nishkam karma, action without desire for the fruits of action, is one of the most fundamental principles of the spiritual life. And a great deal of sadhana is just that constant effort when the mind wanders away from the purity of true and appropriate relationship to the divine, that we just keep having to bring it back. This is not really a failure on the spiritual path. This simply is the spiritual path. Now, in this chapter, Swamiji starts by talking about the fact that our sense of separateness, the ego's desire to draw the benefits of its own action, has its foundation in a fundamental misunderstanding that is inherent in being manifested into the material world, which is that we perceive ourselves as separate from the greater reality. And Master says, every atom of creation is dowered with individuality, which is always a wonderful phrase to contemplate. I recently had a case of the flu, and I may have told this story recently, but forgive me if I have, but I had the flu in January, and it was the genuine flu. It wasn't just a cold, and the genuine flu is a very different experience. And for almost 2 weeks, I was a real non-entity. And when I recovered enough to send an email or two, I remarked that I felt I had the intelligence of an earthworm, which was really an improvement over where I had been before. And I had the intelligence of an inanimate object. And someone then sent me a scientific study that had been done on earthworms. I'm so fascinated, like somebody pays somebody to do something like that. I'll give you another scientific study that I really enjoyed. Somebody did a study of squirrels, and they tested to see how many squirrels go back and retrieve the nuts that they've buried. And they decided that squirrels retrieve 1/3 of the nuts they buried. I proposed that maybe they were Mormons and they were storing against hard times, but I don't think that was part of the study. Now, going back to the earthworms, somebody studied earthworms, And what an earthworm primarily does is he wiggles around underground, and I guess he chews on earth or whatever he does, and he passes it through his system. But he's looking for things to eat, and he smells garbage. I don't know what an earthworm's favorite food is, but he does it through the sense of smell, and when he smells something, he'll go toward it. Now, somehow they have noticed that whether or not an earthworm follows up on the scent of food is not predictable by any consistent method. In other words, the earthworm seems to have an opinion about whether or not he's going to follow up on it. And they've somehow determined that an earthworm has 3 brain neurons. I'm just saying what I read. 3 brain neurons. And the 3 brain neurons seem to each have an independent attitude. And whether or not the earthworm will follow up on the food, they said, depends on what he's thinking. Now, I feel I have experienced something close to having 3 brain neurons, but I suspect the earthworm still operates on a lower level than I was operating on. But nonetheless, he has individuality, and he makes decisions based on what he's thinking. I mean, how early does bondage begin? Because what he's living with is his likes and dislikes. I want the garbage. It doesn't smell as good as what I saw yesterday. I wonder if I go over there, if I'll meet that cute little earthworm that was at that garbage heap yesterday. I mean, God knows what he's thinking. Maybe he's tired and just doesn't feel like pushing on. Maybe he feels like he's getting chubby and needs to fast. Who knows what those 3 neurons are doing, but they're all doing something. And now Swami also indicates, he talks about every atom being dowered with individuality. Now, science has never been my strong suit. I am very highly educated in a very narrow strata, and that strata is the teachings of self-realization through Master and Swami. But move me out of that, and I'm not in my strength. Let's just put it that way. So I remember, though, at least what they taught me then, who knows if they still even believe it, about how the atoms have all these different parts to them and how the atoms relate to each other and how this whole universe goes there. And I do remember going to Disneyland to It's a Small World, where they make you smaller and smaller until you're looking inside, where you're inside atoms and you're seeing the whole universe of the atom. Well, in this commentary, Swami says that the atom is trapped within the individual universe, that it may have individuality, but it doesn't have the power in and of itself to break out of the preordained system in which it finds itself. Forces around it will change it, who knows? He doesn't go on at great length. Now, what Swamiji is saying is that the ego, which is a far more complex pattern of energy than a single atom, also finds itself captive in this universe and finds itself continually acting out and bound by the cause and effect realities of the universe in which it finds itself. It finds itself bound by the karmic forces that it has set in motion itself, causes lost in the past that are now coming to fruition. But the ego is sufficiently self-aware that it can extricate itself from the universe of cause and effect in which it finds itself trapped. Now, that is the process of awakening. What would you say? How would I say it? The drive that I felt from a very young age, to find something that I didn't know what it was, articulated itself in my mind as a desire to be happy. I didn't I partly thought of it as a desire to avoid suffering, but mostly it was put in the positive. My life was pretty cheery, and I just wanted more of that. I wasn't consciously motivated until later by the compelling necessity to escape suffering. It was there, but I didn't know it. I just thought of it as, how do I find happiness? And I didn't have words for it until I discovered the teachings of self-realization and got onto the spiritual path. But what I felt was intensely confined. I was a perfectly capable person. I had a very comfortable upbringing. I was talented. It seemed like really anything that you could describe that a person might do, I certainly had the potential to do it. I wasn't handicapped or underprivileged in any way. But everything that I looked at that would have been the natural direction for me to take, and I was school smart, and I was from a somewhat intellectual family, so it was the professions or serviceful work, even medicine or something like that. But now what I understand is all of them seemed confined. It's like even at the end, at the successful completion of walking down any of those roads and being at the pinnacle of what they had to offer, it would still feel really, really small. And of course, when I found the teachings of self-realization, what I understood was it was the intuitive awareness of the soul's potential compared to the false identification with the limited self. The word jiva is the most useful word in here. Jiva means the infinite self identified with the limited, and the Atman is the infinite individual self. And the jiva builds this identity, and as long as it remains identified, it will always be confined by those definitions. And the whole complex structure of ego is the jiva. Ego is the infinite identified with the limited. And ego isn't evil, it's just what it is. It's this mistaken sense of self. So freedom, moksha, ultimately, that which Ramakrishna devoted his life to and Master devoted his life to, is breaking all those limited identifications. And the spiritual path, sadhana, the practice of sadhana, which is spiritual practices, is systematically to unravel, to break that habit of identifying ourselves and our happiness with that separate individuality. So anything that reinforces that sense of individuality in the wrong way, by that sense of limited identification, is not our friend. And anything that serves to dismantle that is the companion of the seeking soul, of the soul seeking moksha. So we have the simple statement here: let not your ego crave the fruits of action. Let me do what I came here to do, but let it be energy flowing through me rather than energy that I hold on to. Now then comes the phrase, but action in this realm of vibration is a duty, but let not your ego be attached to the fruits. Be not attached to either action or inaction. So then the thought comes that if I don't want to be attached to the fruits, the best way to avoid that temptation would be to do nothing. And this is the subtle point that this verse and a number of the verses that follow seek to unravel. Because we imagine, and the way Swami puts it in this commentary is very simple. He said, as long as you're breathing, he said, you're doing something. It's unless you reach the breathless state of samadhi, of pure union, in which all individual identification, the egoic identification has ceased to exist, you're doing something to affirm your separateness. Breathing itself. It's in this world of vibration. This world of vibration is the manifested universe in which the material, the soul is living in a body. As long as we're conscious of our body, we are acting within the world of vibration, and merely to cease to participate, thinking that ceasing to participate is the same as freedom, does not break that sense of identity. And in fact, what Swamiji writes is that it just dulls our energy. And he says some hermits imagine that if they just drop out of the ordinary world and cease to act, cease to do their duty in any way, that alone will bring them freedom. But Swamiji says what is required to transcend our limited identification is a much expanded sense of awareness. And that we can only get to that expanded sense of awareness by raising our energy level to the point where that awareness exists. And so this is where we come to the lives of many of these great saints who are so intensely active. And it can be even confusing. When Swami Kriyananda was one of the most creative and productive individuals, well, it's really even hard to imagine a person living at the level of energy that he did. In fact, very interestingly, I think it was about 2012, maybe 2011, Swamiji was staying at our house in Palo Alto for a time, which we were the closest community to the San Francisco airport, and Swami traveled so much. Every time he went in and out of the country, he would always stay with us at least for a few days, and then sometimes he would come just to stay with us. But around that time, it might have been 2010, it was in the last years of his life, Swami was reading about the life of Alfonso X, who was the son of, who was a king in Spain, and Swami believes that he was that man. Master had said that he was a king in Spain who helped drive the Moors out of that country. And after various research, they decided that Fernando III, who's considered Fernando the Saint, was Master, and that Swamiji was his son, Alfonso X, or his grandson, I'm not sure which. In any case, many things about Alfonso's life matched Swami, and Swami became convinced that he had been that man. And it was further confirmed when he went to Spain and went to the tomb of Ferdinand III and so on. Those are all interesting stories, but not the point here. Alfonso, among many other things that he did, was he wrote some 400 pieces of music. But historians speculate that how could one person write so much music? You know, he must have had help. He must have had a studio of people, and who knows, or other people. He put his name on other people's pieces. So Swami just suddenly was seized with this thought that after he dies, nobody's going to believe that he did it either. I mean, 400 pieces of music are just the start of what he did. He wrote 150 books, and he delivered thousands of lectures, and, well, it goes on and on, founded communities, made movies, wrote movie scripts, and endlessly. I knew him, I was in very close association with him from about 1971 till he died in 2013. I cannot remember ever seeing him or hearing about him going through a single day in which he didn't do some creative serviceful work. I mean, when he went in for open heart surgery, he was editing the preface of a book before and after the operation. He just never stopped. So anyway, he conceived of this idea that nobody was going to believe him. So he wrote out this affidavit describing in broad terms all that he'd accomplished and confirming that he edited every word of his writing, that every word was sincerely inspired by Master, that he wrote every one of his own songs, that the few paintings he did them themselves, that all the lectures were his own. And he just verified it. And he said, he also just threw in there, he said, Alfonso X was equally productive. And then he said, I was able to do this through the inspiration of my guru and by allowing myself simply to be a channel for higher consciousness. And he said, and I believe that's how Alfonso did it too, he throws in. And then he signed it. We didn't have it notarized, but he signed it. And then he asked others of us to write affidavits to that effect. Only a few people did. I wrote that I watched the creation of Swami's manuscripts and received preliminary copies, and he solicited feedback, but our comments were never more than window dressing. The books were all his own. And a few other people wrote what they'd seen. Someone wrote about being present when he wrote this book and how day by day Swami was turning out 10 pages a day. And just to verify it like that. Now, Swamiji, especially earlier in his life, when he was really trying to train us up in all kinds of things, he tried so hard to train us, and we did our best to learn, such as it was. But in any case, oftentimes after a tremendously productive period, he would have a satsang. And I remember on more than one occasion, he actually brought a list of all the things that he had done, and he would say, then I wrote these books, and then Derek Bell was coming to record an album, and the music I had wasn't good enough, so I had 3 days, so I wrote 15 songs with lyrics, and then we did this, and then we did that. And some people having no idea where to put this, just in the same way that seeing Ramakrishna live such an exaggerated, to the normal person's way of thinking, determination to have the vision of God, thought that he was out of his mind. People just thought Swami was an impossible egotist, just presenting us with all these facts. But then he would finish these stories, and then he would say, always, I just put my mind at the spiritual eye, and there it was. And what he was saying was what Jesus said in the Bible. There's nothing special about what I've done. That which I have done, ye shall do too, and this is how it's done. He said, I can't do it. I know I can't do it. And often in the course of those recitations, he would say, it was impossible, but I realized I can't do it, but Master can do it through me. Now, what he's describing is exactly what we're beginning to talk about in this section of the Bhagavad Gita, which is how do we act with full energy in this world, but not have it bind us? How do we act in such a way that our actions won't become a tighter and tighter noose around our freedom? The definition of yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. That's Patanjali's definition. Yoga is the neutralization of the whirlpools of feeling in the heart. The heart is where our spiritual bondage rests, you might say. Swamiji commented once that we talk about meditation as the challenge of calming the mind. But he said, it's not actually the mind that needs to be calmed, it's the heart that needs to be calmed. Master made so many statements of Master are so simple, but the implications of them are enormous. He said so simply, reason follows feeling. 3 simple words. Reason follows feeling. Whatever we are predisposed to feel, the mind will find ways to support that. All of us, I'm sure, well, let me speak for myself and say that perhaps I'm typical. I have a number of embarrassing memories or sometimes mortifying memories of how my emotional prejudice just made it impossible for me to perceive situations correctly. And I'm a bright girl, but if my heart and feelings were too committed, I simply had no idea what was going on around me. And when we when we sit to meditate, if the heart is oscillating between its likes and dislikes, then the mind, it's impossible for the mind to become calm. Of course, we notice that in meditation, the things we're worried about, the things we're attached to. In another class I gave recently, based on the book Conversations with Yogananda, he was talking about the fact that most people do not live in the present, that they live, let's see, what phrase did he use? Now I can't remember the exact words for it. I'm going to find it because it's right here. Because there's 4 words that I like really well. Just give me a second. I know right where we were. Yes. Very few people live in the present, isn't that so? This is number 294. That's true, Master replied. Most people live in the past with nostalgia. That was the word I was looking for. With nostalgia or regrets, or in the future, with hopes and fears born of desire. Think about that. I gave the whole class on nostalgia, regrets, hopes, and fears, and I could have talked about it for a whole lot longer. So the vrittis of chitta, of feeling in the hearts, that Patanjali is talking about calming in order to have union with God, if we're completely in the moment, there's no nostalgia, there's no regret, there's no hope or fear. But those 4 qualities in God knows what combinations always keep us in the world of vibration. Because if we came into the perfect now, outside of time, outside of nostalgia, regret, hopes or fears, then there's perfect stillness. And that's what happens when we, by Kriya practice or by devotion or by the grace of the moment, when we actually do come into that calmness, all of that ceases to exist. I had an amusing moment with Swami Kriyananda many years ago, in the early 70s. I have a very active mind. That's the nice word for it. Restless might be another word for it. Nostalgia, regret, hopes, and fears have been a really big part of my reality. I'm going to put it at least I've made progress. But then I was just, always bubbling over with something. And I was sitting with Swamiji, and Seva and I were the only ones in the room with him at the time. And he was sitting in such a way that I was a little behind him and he couldn't see me. And he was talking to her. And then suddenly he said, "Asha, are you still in the room?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "Why can't I feel you here?" And as it happened, I was in an extraordinarily uplifted state, which was very unusual for me. And I said to him, "It's because I'm so calm, sir." And then Swami shut his eyes. He never turned around. He just shut his eyes and tuned in. He said, he said, "Yes, there you are." It was just so true. I was in a completely other place. He was used to the normal oscillation of my brain, of my thinking process, and when it calmed down, he didn't even recognize me. Swami has often commented that he doesn't really see people physically. He just feels their consciousness and mind shifted so much he didn't know who I was. It was like I was wearing a mask. Amazing, isn't it? Right? Okay. So the neutralization of these vortices of feeling, the attachment to the results of our actions, the fear about whether it won't come out right, the nostalgic reviewing in our minds of our great successes, the hope that in future we'll be recognized or appreciated or loved or whatever it is that we want. All of these things, the way Master describes it in that particular comment, keep us out of the present, and therefore they keep us in vibration. And the breath is just the most basic manifestation of our participation in the vibratory world. It never stops unless we go into a superconscious state or until we die. That's how you tell people are dead, is because they stop breathing. I mean, unless, of course, it's the case of yogis, but I've had what I call the great privilege of being present, at the time, at the passing of a number of people through the course of my life, my elderly father, a few friends, and so on. And people leave the body in different ways. But, the cessation of breath, especially if it's become a vigil and a person is exiting over a matter of days or even weeks or hours, but you begin to just watch the breath, watch their breath, and just everything becomes stiller and stiller. A person actually dies from the extremities, and so they gradually become paralyzed. And this is not, I don't mean any of this morbid, it's actually extraordinarily beautiful to be part of it, especially if the person dying has some spiritual consciousness and you know that they are expanding with this experience rather than suffering from it. But they remain in this world as long as they're breathing, and then there's the point at which they stop breathing. And that's that. I know when my father took his last exhalation, and there it was, it went out. Simultaneously with that exhalation, there was this extraordinary rising sense of joy. He was elderly, he'd lived a good life, my mother had already passed, and I believe he was reunited with her. I think he was happy to be done with that old body, who knows. This extraordinary sense of joy went with it, just as that last breath went away. So back to where we were with this being here in the now and trying to still those vortices of feeling, everything we do that reinforces our definition, and even as a separate entity, which is the ego, and even more, that makes our happiness dependent on how we define ourselves and how that works out, all we're doing is making ourselves vulnerable to suffering. I mean, that's sort of what it comes down to. We don't want to do things that make us more vulnerable to suffering. This world is not constituted on the level of the material plane for perfect happiness. I don't want to become a cynical old person because it's not very attractive. And it's not very attractive for me to live that way either. But I certainly have to say, the longer I live, the more I understand Master saying, get away from my ocean of suffering. And when I was younger, I lived in hope. I lived in hope that somehow for me it would work out. Sister Gyanamata says some very, very strong things in her book, God Alone, which is really one of the great all-time spiritual books. And she says, I'm paraphrasing, but this is close to what she said. She came to realize that she would have to give up everything, even those things that harmed no one, that were hers by right. I love that, the little combination. This is my own little treasure, and it's I deserve this, and it's not hurting anybody, I get to keep it. But it's that to the extent to which the ego wants to hold on to the fruit of its own actions, whether that fruit is the result of past karma that has brought you these blessings, or however you want to say it, to that extent, we're oscillating. Rather than being utterly content with whatever is, a small part of us is pulled to one side or the other. Now, coming back to a moment to the delusion then that people get into, which is the less I do, then the safer I am. But to lower our energy level below that of attachment, is not the same as raising our energy to transcend it. You know, that was the line that Swami was walking, that he was always trying to explain to us, because he put out so much energy. He was so energetic, he was so determined, he had such a capacity to transcend the limitations of his body or circumstances. He was amazing that way. But he still was conscious of the fact that Kriyananda existed. In fact, the way he put it, I loved. He said, I never identify with Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda to me is an event for which I am responsible. And it was such a perfect way to phrase it, because he had incarnated as Swami Kriyananda. It was his body. It was his commission from his guru. It was a responsibility he had to carry through what his guru had asked him to do. It wasn't that he could just sit this one out. Kriyananda was the event for which he was responsible. But being responsible for an event and carrying it out correctly is not the same as identifying with it to the point where you yourself think you have no other reality but that event. It's the picture that I've always loved, is that it's just all in the perspective you have. If you have a huge white wall and there's one black spot in it, if you walk right up to the wall and put your eyes against the black spot, then that's all the reality there will be. The whole white wall exists around it, but if our sense of relationship is only with that one spot, then that's the only reality we have. So we are individual expressions of infinity, and the jiva exists, and it always exists, but whether we are always thinking of it like this, or whether it exists in this vast tapestry of infinity, this is what the Bhagavad Gita is trying to get us to understand. And this is what Swami meant when he said, I can't do it. If I think of myself as an individual entity separate from all of creation, there's no possibility that I would have the energy or the insight to carry this through. But if I disidentify with my limitations and identify with my infinite nature, my discipleship to Master, my devotion to him, and identify with his ability to flow through me, well, the results we saw in his life and have seen in the lives of every great master, it's just there is literally then no limit to what is possible. And this is exactly what the Gita is training us to do. We just have to start where we are, by beginning to recognize that it's the flow of energy through us that matters, not the results of that energy. That's what Swami was saying. Put your mind here and let that energy flow. And just become part of the flow of energy rather than the individual entity trying to hold that energy to bring about what it is that I myself particularly want. So it's about likes and dislikes. It's about hopes, fears, nostalgia, and regrets. Really, unbelievably so. Let me just see now where I am, if there's more I want to say here. Swami, Master had this wonderful phrase that I just loved because of its sheer, it just didn't make it, from the ordinary point of view, it never made sense. Master said that people make the mistake of thinking that everything that happens to them concerns them personally. The first time I heard that, it was so far from anything that I could even imagine. I just laughed. I didn't know where to put it. Of course it concerns me personally. After all, it happened to me. And I've heard Swami say many times that, ultimately, pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering are not that different one from another. Now, I can't even begin to say that my vrittis have subsided to the point where I no longer care. I still care very deeply. But from time to time, I begin to see what Swami's talking about. Either we're living in the realm of duality, or we've transcended it. And the difficulty is not the particular wave that you happen to be in. The difficulty is that we think that these rising and falling waves concern us personally, and that because things have not gone the way I think they should have gone, therefore I suffer. And because everything has gone the way I want it to go, therefore I am happy. It's the vritti itself that holds our experience identified with that ego. So we have to begin somewhere. So we begin just trying to unravel this by working selflessly, just for the sake of doing it and for the sheer joy of it, to the point where, attention and reward, far from feeling like something that we crave, actually feel like less than the joy of just doing it for the experience, if that makes sense. It's let me find the words that I'm thinking of. It was so interesting to watch Swamiji, because when you try to repudiate the ego and all its glories, so many people think they're helping you by trying to persuade you that you shouldn't. Swamiji would be so impersonal about the things he had done. And he would say, well, Master did it through me, or it's all God's Leela, or God is the doer. And people would then say, well, yes, but God has to have an instrument, like that. And you can't argue. But even that thought, coming into ourselves, or other people putting it on you, we need to be divine friends to each other. We had a discussion in our community, in a little gathering we have in our community recently, about how and whether or not to thank and praise each other for the work that we do. Now, Swamiji was extremely appreciative of every little action and every service. He was exceedingly gracious, to the point when I worked for him as his secretary for a period of time. Every afternoon, at that time we had no phones and no computers, no electricity even, and all information came through the mail or through one of the phones that was centrally located. But at the end of each day, during the week, Seva and I, Kalyani, sometimes others, would go over to Swamiji's house. We'd bring him the mail and we'd bring him the messages from the day. I did that every day, and often, gradually I began also to cook dinner for him. This was when he was writing the path and was very busy, was very preoccupied. Often I would cook dinner for him. Sometimes I would retype his manuscript, and I would often, arrive at 4 and leave at 10, 11, 12, 1, 2 in the morning sometimes. It was my only priority. It was not my first priority, it was my only priority. And because the pattern of the day once I arrived at Swamiji's house was completely unpredictable, I never made any other plans. That's all, never. Because I never wanted to have to say to him, I'm sorry, I can't stay. And it was my job. He also paid me to work for him out of his own wallet. He would open his wallet every month and hand me $50, which, believe it or not, was enough. But every single time when we showed up, every afternoon, oh, he'd say, there you are. How nice of you to come over. Just like it's the 100th day in a row that we've shown up like this, and there's not a chance in the world that we're not going to come. But every time we came, he was totally surprised or totally fresh in his appreciation of it. I never became his secretary. I never became the woman who comes over to type the manuscript, the person who'll cook him dinner. Never. Every time I walked in, it was like out of the goodness of my heart, I had arranged my life to come over to see if he needed anything. I said to him at one point, Swamiji, I feel like every night you completely erase all expectations. And so it's not an affectation when I show up again. It's that you genuinely have no expectations. And when I do come, it's just so gracious and nice of me to show up. Remarkable. Oftentimes with Swamiji, I would think that he had a good attitude, and then I would gradually realize he didn't have a good attitude. He had a totally different consciousness. And when I would cook a meal or type a manuscript, even then, he rarely would ask directly. He would just hint or introduce the subject and see what I was willing to do. And, I became adept at volunteering or following his hints or whatever they might be, because I knew that if I didn't show a willingness, he would never consider it his due. So he was always grateful and always gracious. That was such a delicious dinner. How very nice of you to come over. I'm so grateful when you do the manuscript. Thank you, Seva, for bringing the mail. Always like that. But at the same time, I feel like we always have to help each other not fall into a routine where we're waiting to be thanked. It's very subtle. But and one of the ways we do it, I think, is the way in which what we thank each other for, if you know what I mean. I remember this man was a very wonderful pianist, Gary Goldschneider. I don't know if he lived in the Nevada County area where Nanda Village is, and he and Swami became friends because they were both artists at a very high level. And Gary came over, and this was the day there were several things happened. Once he and Swami were talking about music on a level that I could barely even understand the words, what to speak of, comprehend what they were talking about. And finally, Gary became so, Gary realized that there was a limitation to words, and he walked over to the piano in the living room there and just sat down and demonstrated by playing what he was trying to say. And it was so extraordinary to watch that, because there was no music being played in the room, and then suddenly this music just flooded into the room. And it was because, of course, Gary had put his hands on the piano. But it wasn't really, he himself identified so little with what he was doing that it was like he was invisible, and all he'd done was open a door and the music flooded in. And it had always been there, and he just opened the door, and then the music was there. And later, when he was performing, I said to him, "Oh, Gary, that music was so beautiful." And I remember he looked at me and he said, "Thank you for praising the music." He said, "So many people praise the pianist." And he just looked exhausted, by that misunderstanding. And of course, that was one of the reasons he was so good at what he did. He recognized that it was the music. And so we ourselves, when we act, it's not that I am doing it, it's that this is happening. Haridas, who has a marvelous way, Haridas lives now in Bangalore with his wife Roma. Haridas has always had this marvelous way of putting things in the perfect, humble way. And he said whenever he would get complimented for a Sunday service or something that he'd done, he would say with this kind of childlike enthusiasm, and again, this was not affectation, this is just how he felt. "Yes," he said, "something inspiring happened and I got to be there." That's the way to think about it. Because also, we don't get out of action, well, as Swami said to me once, we don't get out of karma by doing it badly. He said, doing it badly usually means that we are in the grip of tamo guna. And if we're in the grip of tamo guna, we are trapped on the vibratory level of creation. That's why we have to transcend the vibratory level of creation by mastering the three gunas. This is either it was or it's coming. I think actually it was in the Gita. I think it was a little bit earlier, where we talked about how a master lives beyond the three gunas, and we as devotees have to transcend the gunas. So excellence and perfection in what we're doing comes when we transcend the downward pulling energy that causes us to be lazy, inattentive, or not in tune with what we're trying to accomplish. When our active energy has become free of tamas, inspired by sattva, allows us to be in tune with a higher level of energy, then action becomes inaction, because the ego is no longer identified with what it's doing. It's just a flow of energy going through us. Anybody who is able to concentrate deeply and do creative work always comes to that point. A friend of mine was a doctoral student in physics at Stanford University. The community I live in Palo Alto is right near Stanford. And he was concerned. He was also a Kriyaban and a devotee. He said, I sit down with my physics problems in the morning, he said, and I look up and the day is over. And he was worried that there was something wrong with that. I said, you should fall on your knees and thank God every day. Because he would lose himself so completely in the magnificence of the world as he saw it as a physicist, that literally he would cease to exist. And there was no identification with the fruits of the labor. There was no identification even with the labor. He just, the individual self had ceased to be. There was only the flow of energy. Then there's no praise, blame, there's no exhaustion, there's no hopes, fears, or worries either, because it's just the energy. That's how Swami was able to accomplish. There were no conflicting cross currents of ego for him. I've had a great deal of difficulty in my life becoming confident in my ability to write. In recent years, I've made great strides in this, but a decade ago when I was really struggling with this, my energy was so blocked. And Swami said to me on the phone, I never get writer's block, just like that. Oh dear. But it was actually very helpful, because he was trying to diffuse the thought that this was a big deal, because it was my identification with my suffering and so on, my inadequacies, all of that, hopes and fears that were just holding me bondage. And Swami just went like that. He said the only time he ever had trouble writing was when someone said his writing was so good he must have been Shakespeare in a past life. In fact, he may have been Shakespeare in a past life, but in any case, he said when he sat down to write that day, he said the thought was in his mind, mustn't disappoint my public. And he said he couldn't get even one sentence to come out in order. He said he just kept rearranging words and rearranging words. He couldn't figure out what was wrong. And then he realized that egoic relationship to the fruit of his labor had infected his mind, and he just repudiated that thought. He said, and immediately the energy started flowing again. Well, anyone who concentrates on creative work enough at least has moments where suddenly you realize something else has taken over. And this is where Swamiji says, this is the level that we're working for, but it takes intense discipline and energy to get there. We can move effortlessly in a subconscious realm, just sort of doing whatever we feel to do. And it's very interesting when you look at art and people's writing and just anything. You know, sometimes things are quite interesting and even quite beautiful, but you can sort of feel what level of consciousness it came from, whether it was just the ego self rearranging what it already knows, even rearranging it very artistically, or whether it was actually an inspiration. I wrote a little story once that Swami read, and it wasn't very good. That was during my Tapasya years working with this. And it wasn't terrible, but his words were, he said, it's mental, was his word. And he was right. That was exactly the right word for it. It had come out of my mind, and it came out of intense self-consciousness and out of my mind. But other writing that I'd done, you know, it wasn't. I don't know how else to say it. It just wasn't. And we train ourselves to move to that level by intense selfless service. That's what the Gita says. We have to work intensely hard in a selfless way, to raise our energy to the level where our awareness expands, and that we can touch into the superconsciousness and be free. It's a great effort, that every saint and every sage has told us that it's well worth it. And what choice do we have really? To remain as we are is not desirable. The longing for freedom must be fulfilled.